Bryan Kohberger, the man who murdered 4 University of Idaho students, has reportedly begun making threats. While at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, he sent messages to prison staff with a chilling ultimatum: move him out of his current unit or he'll harm himself. In just a few weeks, inmates named him the Prison Karen, a man who spent his entire incarceration complaining about everything from the quality of his bananas to the taunts coming through the vents. Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty earlier this year to the murders of 4 University of Idaho students, Kaylee Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, and is now serving 4 consecutive life sentences. But instead of accepting his fate quietly, he's been filing complaint after complaint, demanding transfers, better food, protection from other inmates. And now he's threatening to hurt himself if they don't give him what he wants. So here's the question everyone's asking. Is Bryan Kohberger genuinely suicidal, or is he just playing the system, using the threat of self-harm as leverage to escape the one thing he can't control: being trapped with inmates who hate him? Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from, because this story isn't about sympathy, it's about manipulation. And we're about to break down exactly how Bryan Kohberger is trying to game the prison system from the inside. Kohberger is being held in J Block at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution, alongside other convicted killers, including Chad Daybell and Thomas Creech, both of whom are sentenced to death. This isn't general population. This is the unit reserved for high-profile, high-risk inmates. The kind of people who can't be mixed with the regular prison crowd because they're either too dangerous or too famous. And from day one, Kohberger made his first request to be moved to another facility. Why? Because the other inmates in J Block hate him, and they're not quiet about it. Bryan Kohberger sits alone in a single-person cell in J Block at the Idaho Maximum Security Institution. The cell is roughly 8 by 12 feet, a steel toilet, a concrete slab for a bed, a small desk bolted to the wall. He spends 23 hours a day locked inside this space, with 1 hour of outdoor recreation in what inmates describe as chain-link cages littered with urine and feces. The PhD student who spent years studying criminal minds and offender psychology is now living the life he once analyzed from the safety of academic classrooms. And he's not handling it well. Just 1 week into his life sentence, Kohberger files his first official complaint with prison authorities. In careful handwriting on standard prison forms, he writes that he wishes to discuss if he may be transferred to another administrative segregation setting, such as B Block. His reason for the transfer request is specific and detailed. He claims that other inmates in J Block are flooding their cells with toilet water and directing minute-by-minute verbal threats and harassment at him through the air vents that connect the cells. He wants out of J Block. Prison officials review his complaint and deny the transfer request. Their response is brief and dismissive. They note that J2 tier, where Kohberger is housed, is generally a fairly calm and quieter tier compared to other areas of the facility. They tell him to give it some time to adjust. But Kohberger doesn't give it time. The very next day, July 31st, he files a second complaint. This one is about food. He writes that he has specifically requested a vegan diet, but the prison is not meeting this dietary requirement. He states that on several occasions, he has not received all items of food on his tray. He complains that the nutritional standard is not being upheld unless he receives his full tray. He wants someone to address these deficiencies immediately. Again, prison officials review the complaint. They find no evidence that his dietary needs are being ignored. The complaint is noted, but results in no action. On August 4th, less than 2 weeks into his sentence, Kohberger filed a third complaint. This one is different. This one details specific sexual threats that other inmates have been making against him. According to his written complaint, inmates have been shouting threats through the ventilation system, telling him in explicit terms what they plan to do to him if they ever get the chance. A prison guard who investigated this complaint confirmed that vulgar language was indeed being used and directed toward Kohberger from other cells. However, despite this confirmation, officials still could not identify a specific aggressor because the voices echoed through the ventilation system in ways that made it impossible to determine which cell they were coming from. The transfer request is denied again. These three complaints represent just the beginning. In his first month at Idaho Maximum Security Institution, Bryan Kohberger filed at least 5 separate formal grievances with prison authorities. The complaints range from the serious threats of violence to the mundane issues with his commissary account and problems accessing the JPay electronic messaging system. Prison experts and former law enforcement officials who review these complaints use words like jailhouse Karen to describe Kohberger's behavior. He is acting like an entitled customer demanding better service, seemingly unable to grasp that he is a convicted murderer serving life without parole in one of Idaho's toughest prison facilities. J Block at Idaho Maximum Security Institution houses over 100 inmates, including several men on death row. It is designated for long-term restrictive housing, meaning inmates are kept in near total isolation for extended periods. The daily routine is brutally simple and unchanging. Inmates are locked in their single-person cells for 23 hours. They are allowed 1 hour of outdoor recreation, though this recreation takes place in small chain-link enclosures that previous inmates have described as filthy and degrading. Showers are permitted every other day. Anytime an inmate needs to move from their cell for any reason, they must first be placed in full restraints, including handcuffs and leg shackles. Food is passed through a slot in the cell door. Human contact is minimal and impersonal. Communication with other inmates happens primarily through the air vents that connect the cells, creating an acoustic nightmare where voices bounce and echo, making it nearly impossible to identify who is speaking. Among the inmates housed in J Block is Chad Daybell, the man currently on death row for murdering his 2 stepchildren and his former wife in a case that drew national attention. Kohberger now shares this space with exactly the type of violent offenders he once studied as a graduate student in criminology. The irony is profound and unavoidable. The man who wanted to understand why criminals kill is now living alongside them, subject to the same conditions, treated the same way by guards and staff. But there is one crucial difference. The other inmates know who Bryan Kohberger is. They know what he did. They know he killed 4 college students, including 2 young women, in their beds while they slept. And in the brutal social hierarchy of prison, killers who target young women and children occupy the very lowest rung. They are considered the worst of the worst. They are targets. Before his transfer to Idaho Maximum Security Institution, Kohberger spent time in Latah County Jail while awaiting trial and sentencing. Even there, his behavior drew attention from both guards and fellow inmates. He would stay awake almost all night, sleeping only during daylight hours. When he did shower, the sessions would last 45 minutes to an hour, far longer than normal. Guards reported that he washed his hands dozens of times per day, exhibiting what appeared to be obsessive-compulsive behavior. Other inmates found him annoying. He kept to himself mostly, but there was at least one documented outburst when he apparently thought another inmate had insulted either him or his mother. The details of that incident were never made fully public, but it demonstrated that beneath his carefully controlled exterior, Kohberger had a temper that could flare under the right circumstances. The harassment Kohberger faces in J Block is not unique to him, though it may be more intense given the nature of his crimes. Inmates can hear conversations happening several cells away. They can shout messages that echo through the entire tier. And they can direct those messages at specific targets, like Bryan Kohberger, knowing he has no way to escape the sound. He can cover his ears, but the voices still penetrate. He can try to ignore them, but they continue, hour after hour, day after day. The threats, the insults, the graphic descriptions of what they'd like to do to him, the reminders of what he did to Kaylee, Madison, Zaina, and Ethan. To understand why Kohberger ended up in this situation, we need to go back to the crimes that put him here. On November 13, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were stabbed to death in an off-campus rental house in Moscow, Idaho. Kaylee Gonzalez was 21 years old, a senior who had been accepted to law school and was planning to move to Texas. Madison Mogan was also 21, Kaylee's best friend since childhood, studying marketing. Zaina Kernadal was 20 years old, a junior pursuing degrees in marketing and human resources. Ethan Chapin was 20 years old, a freshman and Zaina's boyfriend. The attack happened around 4 in the morning. 3 of the victims were asleep when they were killed. The violence was extreme and fast. By the time police were called later that morning, all 4 were dead. The investigation that followed became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent American history. For weeks, there were no arrests and no clear suspects. The community was terrified. Students left campus. Parents demanded answers. Then investigators began piecing together evidence. A white Hyundai Elantra had been seen near the house around the time of the murders. Cell phone data showed that a phone belonging to Bryan Kohberger had pinged near the area multiple times in the weeks and months before the murders, always late at night, suggesting he had been surveilling the location. Most damning of all, DNA found on a knife sheath left at the crime scene matched Kohberger's genetic profile. He was arrested at his parents' home in Pennsylvania on December 30th, 2022. During the investigation and prosecution, disturbing details emerged about Kohberger's behavior before and after the murders. On the morning after the killings, November 13th, he took a selfie that showed him giving a thumbs-up gesture. Prosecutors later introduced this photo as evidence, with Kaylee Gonzalez's father Steve calling it a trophy photo that demonstrated Kohberger's state of mind. He wasn't horrified by what he'd done. He wasn't spiraling into guilt or panic. He was pleased with himself. He was proud. More revelations came from Washington State University, where Kohberger had been enrolled as a PhD student in the criminology program. Reports showed that more than 13 formal complaints had been filed against him by female students and faculty within just a few months of his arrival on campus. The complaints described him as homophobic, ableist, xenophobic, and misogynistic. Female graduate students reported that he made them deeply uncomfortable with his behavior. He would stand too close. He would position himself near doorways, forcing women to brush past him to leave. His questions in class often crossed boundaries into personal territory. One student who knew him well described him as a narcissist who never displayed empathy and who constantly needed to be the strongest, smartest, most important person in any room. The university eventually held mandatory discrimination training specifically because of complaints about Kohberger's conduct. Faculty members discussed removing him from the program entirely, but the murders happened before any final decision was made. The case moved through the legal system, with Kohberger maintaining his innocence for more than 2 years. Then, on July 2, 2025, in a surprising turn, he changed his plea to guilty to avoid the death penalty, where he admitted to all 4 murders. 3 weeks later, on July 23, 2025, he was sentenced to 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10 years for burglary. At his sentencing hearing, he was given the opportunity to speak. He declined. The families of his victims gave powerful impact statements describing the permanent hole he had torn in their lives. Kohberger sat silently and showed no visible emotion. Then he was taken to Idaho Maximum Security Institution to begin serving his sentence. Less than 2 weeks into that sentence, Bryan Kohberger is filing complaint after complaint, trying to get out of J-Block. Experts in forensic psychology and prison behavior have analyzed his actions and found them revealing. Dr. Gary Brucato, a forensic psychologist who has studied violent offenders, explained that individuals like Kohberger typically seek social acceptance and a sense of command over their environment. By accepting a plea deal and avoiding trial, Kohberger likely believed he was regaining some measure of control over his fate. He avoided the death penalty. He avoided the public spectacle of a trial. He thought he was making a strategic choice that would give him some power in a powerless situation. Kohberger has made a critical tactical error. In prison, showing weakness or vulnerability only invites more abuse. Inmates who react to taunts and threats are guaranteeing that those taunts and threats will continue and intensify. Kohberger would have been better off keeping his mouth shut and enduring the harassment in silence. Now the other inmates know they're getting a reaction, which means they'll keep pushing. If he can't handle the first 2 weeks without filing 5 complaints, how is he going to handle the next 40 or 50 years? Even Kohberger's handwriting has been analyzed by forensic experts, looking for clues about his psychological state. Bart Baggett, a handwriting analyst, examined samples of Kohberger's written complaints and identified what he called a felon's claw in the way Kohberger forms certain letters, particularly lowercase d's. Baggett explained that this specific formation shows anger and hatred embedded in the physical act of writing. His analysis described Kohberger as an incel, just some guy in his basement mad at the world and mad at women. Someone who simply never grew up emotionally or socially. The handwriting, according to Baggett, reveals a person stuck in an adolescent mindset of grievance and resentment, unable to take responsibility or show genuine remorse. The complaints themselves reveal a profound disconnect between Kohberger's perception of himself and the reality of his situation. He writes about his vegan diet as if it's a matter of religious importance deserving immediate attention. He complains about missing items on his food tray as if he's a customer at a restaurant who didn't get the side dish he ordered. He requests a transfer to a different cell block as if it's a reasonable accommodation that should be granted as a matter of course. There is no acknowledgement in any of these complaints that he is exactly where he deserves to be. There is no reflection on the fact that 4 people are dead because of his actions. There is no consideration for the families who will never see their children again. It is all about him, his comfort, his dietary preferences, his desire not to be harassed. The only difference is that now he has no power, no platform, and no audience that cares. The man who once studied power dynamics in criminal behavior is now powerless. The man who researched how offenders think is now the offender being studied and analyzed. The transformation is complete and it is permanent. There is no appeal. When Kohberger accepted the plea deal, he waived his right to challenge his conviction. There is no possibility of parole. The sentences are consecutive, meaning even if one were somehow overturned, he would still be serving 3 other life sentences. There is no escape. The complaints will be filed and denied. The harassment will continue. The years will stretch into decades, and Bryan Kohberger will remain in that cell, living the nightmare he created for himself. The families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin have had to endure unimaginable pain throughout this process. They sat through hearings and listened to evidence. They gave victim impact statements describing their loss. Steve Goncalves spoke about his daughter Kaylee's strength and bravery, noting that she would have fought back hard if she'd had any chance. He talked about the future she lost, the law career that will never happen, the family she'll never have. Other family members described the ripple effects of the murders, the way grief has permanently altered their lives, the birthdays and holidays that will forever be marked by absence. And through all of this, Bryan Kohberger has never explained why he did it. Even when he pleaded guilty, he offered no motive, no explanation, no insight into what drove him to commit these murders. The families are left with convictions and sentences, but no real answers. They know he did it. They don't know why. What lies ahead for Bryan Kohberger is a life of monotony, isolation, and slow psychological deterioration. The complaints he files now will become routine. Prison officials will process them with the same bureaucratic indifference they show to all inmate grievances. Some will be investigated and dismissed. Others will be ignored entirely. The harassment from other inmates will likely continue for years, possibly for decades, until either Kohberger is moved to a different facility or the inmates currently tormenting him are released or transferred themselves. But new inmates will arrive, and they too will learn who he is and what he did, and the cycle will begin again. The 1 hour of daily recreation will be spent in chain-link cages, alone, staring at concrete walls or patches of sky. The showers every other day will be brief and supervised. The meals passed through the door slot will be nutritionally adequate, but never satisfying. There will be no comfort, no pleasure, no joy, no hope. This is the life he will live until he dies of old age or illness, decades from now. The PhD student who wanted out of J Block is never getting out. Not to B Block, not to any other facility, not to freedom. He made his choice on November 13, 2022, when he drove to that house in Moscow, Idaho, and attacked 4 innocent people. He made his choice when he left a knife sheath with his DNA at the crime scene. He made his choice when he took that thumbs-up selfie the next morning. He made his choice when he pleaded guilty to avoid execution. Every choice has led him to that 8 by 12-foot cell where he spends 23 hours a day listening to other inmates threaten him through ventilation shafts. Every complaint he files is a reminder that he fundamentally doesn't understand that this is justice. This is what accountability looks like. This is the consequence of destroying 4 lives and 4 families. Kaylee Goncalves had her whole life ahead of her. Madison Mogen had dreams she was working toward. Xana Kernodle was building a future. Ethan Chapin was just starting his adult life. They were 20 and 21 years old. They had parents who loved them, siblings who looked up to them, friends who depended on them. They had careers they wanted to pursue, places they wanted to travel, people they wanted to become. All of that was taken from them in minutes by a man who believed his desires and his darkness were more important than their lives. And now that man sits in a cell, writing complaints about food trays and vegan options and harassment from other inmates, as if any of that matters compared to what he destroyed. The complaints will keep coming. Bryan Kohberger will continue writing his grievances about food trays and cell transfers and harassment from other inmates. Prison officials will continue processing them with bureaucratic indifference. But while Kohberger sits in that cell worrying about his vegan diet and trying to escape the consequences of his actions, 4 families are living with a different kind of life sentence. Steve and Christy Goncalves wake up every morning knowing Kaylee will never call. Jim and Stacy Chapin will never watch Ethan graduate or get married. The Mogens and Kernodles carry the same unbearable weight. These families didn't choose this. They didn't commit any crime. Yet they're serving a sentence that will last the rest of their lives. The man who cried out, "Get me out," from his prison cell made sure that 4 young people would never get out of their final resting places. He made sure their families would never get out of their grief. He made sure an entire community would never fully recover from the horror he inflicted. And now, finally, he's discovering that some choices have consequences you can't escape, no matter how many complaints you file. Justice isn't always perfect, but sometimes it's exactly right. Bryan Kohberger will spend the rest of his life in that cell, and Kaylee, Madison, Xana, and Ethan will never be forgotten. That's not closure, that's not healing, but it's something. It's accountability. And in a case this dark, sometimes that has to be enough. Thank you for watching. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this. Also, share your thoughts in the comments section. We read every one of them.